Thank you for joining us and welcome to the Stantec Water webinar series. It's our pleasure to introduce Nicolle Boulay, Jacangelo, Tyler Hadacek, and Liz Garvey as our presenters. Today, they will discuss the new regulations and upcoming actions for water utilities. I am Tony Fink, your hostess for today. During this meeting, you will be in listen-only mode. We invite you to submit questions at any time during the presentation. If you're joining via computer or your mobile device, you can do so by selecting the Q&A icon in the top panel of your screen. Your questions will be addressed following the presentation. We will also be dropping in notes to the audience in that panel as well. And with that, Nicolle, I'll pass it on to you to get us started.
Thank you, Tony. Hello, everyone. My name is Nicolle Boulay, and this is actually our Part 2 PFAS webinar. On the first webinar we had this year, we focused on piloting and treatment. So in this one, we're going to focus more on source water assessments, operational considerations, and waste treatment, in particular related to the new MCLs that were promulgated in April. Next slide. So our agenda today is here. I'm going to give a few introductions of our speakers and also a very brief overview of the regulations. I know many of you are familiar with them. Jacangelo is going to talk about source water assessments. We're going to have Tyler talk about operational considerations for PFAS project implementation. And then finally, Liz is going to finish up talking about PFAS treatment residuals management. And then we're going to have about 30 minutes, hopefully, for Q&A. So please go ahead and post those questions as we discuss. Next slide. Okay, so here are our speakers. I mentioned myself, I'm Nicolle Boulay. I'm our water treatment sector leader. I work out of our Fairfax, Virginia office, and I have a background in water treatment design and construction. Dr. Joe Jacangelo is here, and he's a vice president with Stantec and also our director of research. He works out of our DC office, Washington, DC office, and he's worked on multiple PFAS-related projects around the country. Joe also leads our partnership with Johns Hopkins University. Tyler Hadacek is in our Austin, Texas office, where he's a process engineer there. And he has worked on, also similar to Joe, worked on multiple PFAS-related projects. And recently, he's worked on some ion exchange treatment facilities for Orange County, California. And then Liz Garvey is a process engineer in our Burlington, Massachusetts office. And she has really taken it upon herself to become our company's resource on PFAS and residuals and other waste products. And I want to mention also here, before going to the next slide, I have a couple of other resources on the call who can maybe help answer some of your questions. Katie Chamberlain is a water treatment regional sector leader in our U.S. North region, and she has a lot of experience helping clients with PFAS issues in the Northeast and in the Midwest. And then Ryan Capel is our global PFAS leader, and he has been working with Cottage Grove, Minnesota since 2017 and helping them with bench scale testing, piloting, full-scale treatment, startup, and operational issues. So he has a range of experience. So we have a lot of folks here ready to answer your questions. Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to give a very brief regulatory overview. You can go to the next slide, Ryan. And if anyone is interested in more details, we do have a much more detailed presentation we could provide at a later time. But here are the MCLs and the MCLGs that came out and were promulgated in April, on April 26, 2024. And so the maximum contaminant level goals are listed as well as the maximum contaminant levels. And PFOA and PFAS MCLs are at 4.0 parts per trillion. This remained the same from the draft MCL. One thing that's interesting is the significant figures really matter. So I wanted to talk about that briefly. For the PFOA and PFAS, those are based on two significant figures. So if you have 4.1 parts per trillion PFOA, you would be out of compliance. But a 4.04 parts per trillion, this would be rounded down to to 4.0, and so you would be in compliance. So significant figures do matter, and again, we do have more slides to go into that, but wasn't planning to do that today in the interest of time. So for some of the other PFAS compounds like PFNA, PFHXS, and GenX, there were MCLs established for those at 10 parts per trillion. This is different from the draft that was originally published. Originally, those compounds were just part of a hazard index. PFBS is the only compound that was not included in the as a separate MCL. And compliance with these compounds is based on one significant figure. So an example would be PFNA. If you had a value of 11.2 parts per trillion, this would round to 10 parts per trillion, and you would be in compliance. And so finally, the rule does require 5 years from rule promulgation to be in compliance, and that would be on April 26th of 2029. Next slide. So this slide just shows how you calculate the hazard index at the bottom of the slide there. In the denominator are the health-based water concentrations, and then in the numerator, you would just insert your measured values for the various compounds. And when you are calculating those, you don't want to round them during the calculation. Then once you get the final hazard index calculation, you can round that to see whether you're in compliance. Next slide. So just a couple of key compliance activities that come out of the recently published regulation. All utilities are going to be required to do initial PFAS monitoring at the entry point to the distribution system and take samples quarterly over 12 months. If those, depending on how the samples come back, you may be eligible for reduced monitoring, and there are some rules around that. The compliance is based on a running annual average, which Katie Chamberlain was pointing out to me is a little interesting because based on that running annual average, you may have to be in compliance 3 quarters before the compliance period so that the running annual average is actually in compliance. So that could mean that you may have just a little over 4 years to be able to get into compliance. So that, not necessarily good news there. So values below the practical quantification level, or PQL, and there's a PQL for each of those compounds, count as 0 in the RAA calculation. So for example, PFAS has a PQL of 2. So if you have 2 or less, then you get to count that as 0 in your running annual average. And then there's 2 tiers of reduced monitoring available for the PFAS results below these trigger levels. Again, there's trigger levels for each compound. And you may be eligible for reducing your monitoring to either annual or every 3 years, depending on the situation. And of course, the PFAS results must be reported in your annual consumer confidence report. So for some folks, this may be the first time PFAS results are being reported, so you may want to think about the messaging around that. Next slide. So I just wanted to mention the CERCLA rule that went into place in April of this year. So this is the EPA's Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act. And under this act, EPA designated 2 PFAS compounds, PFOA and PFAS, as hazardous substances under CERCLA. Liz is going to get into more detail about this and the implications of it. But essentially, water and wastewater utilities were not exempted from liability. EPA did make a statement in the middle there. It says EPA will not pursue entities where equitable factors do not support seeking response actions or costs under CERCLA. But I know that our water industry is working to try to change the situation in Congress such that water and wastewater utilities are exempted from liability. And what we're seeing are that some solids waste disposal facilities, such as incinerators and landfills, have responded to this by restricting receiving waste with PFOA and PFAS. At a minimum, they're asking, what are the levels that you have? So again, Liz is going to go into that in more detail. I'm going to turn it over now to Dr. Joe Jacangelo.
Thanks, Nicole. Good morning, everyone. Today I'm going to talk to you about source water assessments, how to conduct them, and I'll give you some ideas of the projects that we're currently undertaking that deal with assessing source waters from various parts of the country. Now, when we talk about sources of PFAS in our environment, there are a variety of sources as shown in this slide, but I'm only going to highlight a couple. Some that we're familiar with, and maybe perhaps some that we're not so familiar with. But some that jump out of us are, for example, firefighting and the use of AFFF, which is firefighting foam. Another one are various consumer goods, such as pizza boxes, perfumes, anti-stain on your fabrics, etc. And then some that we're more familiar with is wastewater and wastewater treatment plants. We know that PFAS are often detected in wastewaters and can actually increase throughout the treatment plant. And biosolids, of course, are a source. And finally, I'll just touch on landfill leachates, which can be a source that enter the wastewater streams. And they're usually not in high volumes, but they can be very concentrated, often in the microgram or even the milligram per liter levels of PFAS can be observed. Now, when we talk about the detection of PFAS when conducting source water assessments, there are really two approaches. The first approach is to detect the compounds or the PFAS compounds individually, or to use surrogates of those compounds. And so when we look at the total PFAS that we're examining, there are the surrogates, such as extractable organic fluorine or absorbable organic fluorine, which I won't go into now. But one perhaps surrogate that's more often used is what's called the TOP assay, or total organic precursor assay, which is often useful to get a better view of what the total PFAS concentration may ultimately be. Now, when we talk about our individual compounds, those that are regulated, for example, by US EPA, we usually conduct and analyze them through what's called LC tandem mass spectrometry. And I'll talk a little bit about that in the next slide. As I mentioned, PFAS are measured through an LC mass tandem mass spec after extraction through solid phase extraction. And in drinking water, we use method 537.1, which is comprised of 18 compounds, or 533, which is comprised of 24 compounds. But when we look at PFAS in surface water, we employ EPA method 33. It should be noted that all three of these methods include the regulated compounds that have been recently promulgated by EPA. When we conduct a source water assessment, the first thing we want to do is to undertake a sampling campaign. And really, the purpose of that is to really get a feel for what's in the actual source and capture the potential drivers or potential point sources or other sources of PFAS in the source water. Now, what's really important when conducting a source water assessment is to understand the variability. And one of the main issues associated with variability is seasonality. So more than just taking one sample and saying that's my concentration, we know that PFAS concentrations will actually change over seasons. So it's important to get a larger picture of what your PFAS situation may actually be. In addition to that, as I mentioned, there are also surrogates. So it's often useful to conduct additional PFAS analysis, such as the TOP assay, but also the greater pool of PFAS too, such as some of the short chain PFAS, which we know are ubiquitous in the environment. And all of this will provide additional support when looking at the source of the potential PFAS within your watershed or in your well water. Let me just briefly touch upon three projects where we looked at sources of PFAS. And what I'll do is introduce them on this slide and then talk about each of them in more depth later. The first project was with North Park Public Water District in Illinois, where we evaluated sources and ultimately solutions to PFAS. And that was performed in conjunction with the North Park Public Water District, as well as our Johns Hopkins University Stantec Alliance. We are also currently undertaking a Water Research Foundation project that looks at the factors which are affecting the seasonality and the variability that associated with it that for PFAS in the Potomac River watershed. And that's being conducted in collaboration with a number of different utilities and agencies, as well as with Johns Hopkins and Stantec. And then finally, I'll just touch upon a study what we're conducting for the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment on behalf of the city of Englewood, Colorado, looking at PFAS in the South Platte River watershed, again in collaboration with Johns Hopkins and the city of Englewood. So the first study I want to touch upon is for North Park, Illinois. And North Park, Illinois has PFAS in their groundwater, in their water wells, and they were interested in trying to find out, well, is there a source that can be pointed to in terms of where the PFAS is coming from? And what we found in the study that we undertook was that PFAS was relatively diffuse, as well as it was widespread in that entire source area. And we looked at a number of different polluters. We looked at over 80 industries and services in the area, such as airports, military facilities, firefighting, as well as other industries, et cetera. But there were no obvious sources that we could pinpoint to say, yes, that was the source of PFAS. We also reviewed a number of documents and databases to evaluate potential PFAS sources in the area. We looked at MPDES permits. We looked at the toxic inventory reports, leaking underground storage tanks, as well as 4 or 5 other different potential sources of information that may give us some clue as to where that PFAS was coming from. But the ability to identify this PFAS was limited because we weren't readily able to contact these industries and other potential sources and get information from them, simply because it's often difficult to speak frankly with a lot of the industries, et cetera, as to what they're using in terms of their manufacturing process. So North Park is really an example of where the PFAS concentrations are not exceedingly high. They are diffuse throughout the source area, and no one source could be pinpointed as to where the PFAS may be coming from. And this is not unlike a lot of groundwaters we experience where, again, we can't pinpoint a particular source. The next project I want to talk about is a Water Research Foundation report that has to do with the Potomac River watershed and trying to understand what the PFAS profile within that watershed might look like. Now, the Potomac River watershed is a very large watershed. It spans 4 states and Washington, D.C., and comprised of over 14,000 square miles of land area. And in this study, the particular objective was to identify the factors that contribute or are impacting the presence and variability of PFAS and associated precursor compounds. With that information, the goal was to identify potential sources of PFAS, but also to help inform mitigation strategies should they need to be undertaken. Now, in this particular study, we looked at previous data, and there was really limited data, but more importantly, the data that was available was really disconnected from time, from the geography, and from the season. So it was prudent to undertake a larger sampling program, which was part of this study. So in site selection, what we did is we looked at land use data, we looked at PFAS point sources, we looked at whether it was landfills, fire training areas, airports, et cetera. And we also used USGS gauge data. We looked at all where the utilities were, both water and wastewater, and also tributary locations, so that we could come up with a comprehensive plan of sampling such that we would capture the watershed in the area around Washington, D.C. And we collect samples. We are collecting samples for 44 PFAS, as well as conducting a top assay as part of the study. And as this study progresses, we'd be happy to update you as to what some of the findings were. I'm sure we'll be presenting those at various conferences. And then finally, similar to the other study, this was a watershed study conducted for the South Platte River in Denver, Colorado, and looking at that watershed. And there are very similar characteristics in terms of the data availability, similar to what we found at the Potomac River watershed, where the data that was available was essentially disconnected from time, season, and geography. But one of the things that we really wanted to do in this study was to understand the PFAS and compare less impacted areas to more urban areas. And so the site on the map that you see, to the right here on this slide, there are some areas such as area 16 or site 16 and site 17, as well as site 13, 14, and 15 in the upper left-hand corner of this map. And those are less urban areas and often very rural, whereas the sites to the right of those are much more urban. So this will give us an idea of, again, what may be happening in areas which are not readily impacted, we feel, from PFAS sources, and those that may be, to a much greater extent, be impacted by PFAS. One interesting thing is the South Platte River is heavily impacted by wastewater effluent, and so we'll also be looking at what is the potential contribution of wastewater to the overall PFAS loading. And again, this will be sampling 44 different PFAS. We'll be collecting them over a period of 1 year going forward. So those are 3 examples of water studies that I hope you'll take a look at once they're completed, that may be able to better inform you of how to conduct a source water assessment should you want to do so in the future. With that, I'll turn it over to Tyler, who will speak next.
All right, fantastic. Thank you, Joe. So I'll be continuing on in our discussion here and transitioning into a topic of operational considerations for PFAS treatment implementation. So first, just to quickly cover some of the main treatment technologies that would come up when you consider treatment for PFAS in drinking water. So these 4 technologies are the ones that have been named best available technologies by the EPA earlier this year with the release of the MCLs as well. And so to talk through them just briefly, granular activated carbon, or GAC, ion exchange, or IX. Those are 2 media sorptive type processes. You can see in the photo on the left that those are some vessels that would be used in this kind of treatment technology arrangement. And then the other 2 listed here on the slide, nanofiltration and reverse osmosis, and those are membrane separation processes, which reject PFAS at the membrane surface, and the clean water passes through. You would have a waste stream then as part of those processes. So all 4 of these are effective, and as Nicolle had mentioned earlier, we had a previous webinar where we dove a little bit more into treatment and piloting around some of these technologies, so I encourage you to check that out. Again, I'm going to be focusing on some operational considerations for these, and specifically for the sorptive type processes for GAC, ion exchange, as those are the most widely implemented to date. And so I'll be focusing on that. All right, so some of the operational consideration topics that I'll talk through, the 4 here shown on the slide: pre-treatment, backwash and rinse, hydraulics and piping, and site layout integration. And I think as you'll see, a thoughtful approach to each of these with operations in mind can really have long-term benefits for your treatment performance and operation. So starting with pre-treatment, the purpose here for pre-treating ahead of a PFAS removal system, particularly an adsorptive process, is to remove foulants or solids that can impact the performance of the media. And so on the figure to the right-hand side of the screen, this is showing a kind of a classic time series from left to right for a adsorptive media process where you end up, the media ends up getting more and more filled up with the PFAS or the given contaminant as the water moves over time from top to bottom. And so over time, you have this mass transfer zone that is going further and further down your bed if your media stays in place. And so part of the reason we want to do pre-treatment to avoid head loss buildup and backwashing is because then you would mix your media up, you disturb that mass transfer zone, and you lose some of that performance efficiency. And so that's the reason to avoid backwashing and do pre-treatment to remove the solids ahead of time. And then there's other foulants that could also just adhere to the media and cause performance degradation that I'll talk through. And so we'll talk first about what you need to remove or what you need to think about removing, and then some considerations around what's the best long-term solutions. So when you think about target compounds, I'll talk in a few different categories. The first is solids. As I mentioned, this will lead to buildup of head loss on the media, and you want to avoid that backwashing requirement. And so to remove those solids ahead of time really depends on what solids there are. The point here is there's different size of solids, density of solids, and there's different pre-treatment tools that you have in your toolbox, so to speak, and that have some operational advantages. So if you only need to screen down to like 25 microns, you can use auto backwashing strainers that then remove that operational burden of having to replace bags or cartridges, which would be your finer size filters. So secondly, for inorganics, iron and manganese are known to foul ion exchange or GAC media. You can see the photo on the right-hand side shows some iron fouling of IX resin in one of our pilots in Minnesota. Oxidation filtration is a good pre-treatment go-to step to avoid that from getting to your treatment media for PFAS. The other thing to consider with organics is what other competing compounds you might have, and then co-contaminants. So if you have to remove TDS or hardness, for example, you might want to think about co-treatment maybe with membranes. Alrighty, so on to the last category of compounds. Organics is a broad term, could be a lot of different things. So for something that we would call natural organic matter, this is something very common that you would see in surface waters that would contribute to biological fouling of your media. And so that's something that you want to be able to pre-treat to avoid the biological fouling that could occur downstream. Total organic carbon, would just be a general, bulk term for organic carbon that could be in your water, could be in various forms. And so to understand this, particularly with surface waters more than groundwaters, you're going to see more organics, and piloting is particularly helpful in understanding the impacts to your treatment performance and what are the best pre-treatment alternatives. So you could use just filtration upstream, GAC filtration to knock down your organics with a separate either GAC or IX treatment for PFAS. So a few different things to consider there. Definitely piloting is very helpful in this case. So getting site specific, I'll give 3 case study examples of what pre-treatment solution might make the most sense given different conditions. So in the far left-hand side, we have the city of Santa Ana's PFAS treatment system with ion exchange. So here we did, this is on a groundwater source, we did sand separators followed by cartridge filters. And so the cartridge filters are needed for that fine level of solids removal ahead of ion exchange, because ion exchange is a finer media, more susceptible to head loss buildup. And then the sand separators upstream of that allow those cartridge filters to run for longer by not having to remove the sand. And then the example in the middle is from North Hollywood. This is a much larger facility. This is a 25 and 50 MGD facility. And here, this is treated with GAC. So not as susceptible to needing that fine level of solids pretreatment. And so we ended up using 25 micron auto backwashing strainers. We didn't have as much solids in the water. They're a little bit coarser. So we're able to use these strainers that are self-cleaning so that the operational burden is lifted as far as exchanging actual filters or bags. And then on the far right in North Park, Illinois, this is a graph from pilot testing that we did. This is a graph of differential pressure. The point here is not to understand all of the details, but just to see that these are flat line graphs that over time, over months, we're not seeing any differential pressure buildup. And so if we were to implement GAC in this case, we wouldn't need any pretreatment. So this just goes to show you that you really want to think in terms of your specific site and water quality conditions to get the right solution for you. Lastly, I'm just going to touch on cartridges versus bag filters for that, again, that fine 5 to 10 micron pretreatment. And the point here in the table on the left is really to show the bottom two rows compare what is your life cycle cost if you factor in the labor to do this removal and exchange of the filters versus if you don't consider labor. So for a larger facility, maybe 5, 10 MGD, certainly larger than that, you're going to have to be exchanging a lot of these filters, changing them out once they hit their differential pressure limit. And with larger facilities, that labor burden becomes a lot greater component of that life cycle cost. And so cartridges have a higher dirt holding capacity. And so there's less, they run for longer, there's less need for or less frequent exchanging of those filters. And so it really ends up saving you a lot on labor and ultimately a better life cycle cost, even though they cost more upfront. Bag filters also have a top entry to the filter vessel housing. And so as shown on the figure on the right, a horizontal oriented cartridge filter allows for an ergonomic, ease of filter change out right there at kind of chest height for the operator versus having to reach over for bags. So another advantage to cartridge filters, especially for large scale installations. So pre-treatment considerations, just kind of wrapping up. Some thoughts here to offer to the group in the industry. Think site and project specific. Consider your operational labor and life cycle costs. Think about stockpiling some replacement filters for those bags or cartridges because once you hit a certain DP differential pressure, it climbs quickly, and so your variation in runtime can run out after a certain point pretty quickly. You want to have some filters on hand, and then also just thinking philosophically about this pretreatment as insurance and protection of your PFAS removal performance will go a long way in helping you ultimately. Alrighty, second topic here, backwash and rinse. I'll give a quick kind of overview of where this comes into play for GAC and IX. So on the right-hand side of the screen, you see for GAC media, you're going to need to backwash the media when it comes on site for whenever you're exchanging the media or your first fill. This is to remove fines. You'll have some other water quality, higher pH, potentially arsenic. So you're going to want to wash that media when it comes on site, backwash it, remove the fines, stratify the bed, and then you'll forward rinse both during startup, but then also during short-term down periods to avoid biological growth when you're offline instead of letting the water sit stagnant. For ion exchange, you're only going to do a forward rinse for the same reasons, rinsing it when it comes on site and also for short-term downtime. It's a much lighter, very low specific gravity media, so you can't really backwash it. You don't want to. You'll lose a lot of that resin going out your backwash if you tried to. So some key questions to consider here. The water quality that's coming off of your initial rinsing or backwashing is something you need to think about as far as how much rinsing or washing you need to do to get rid of the fines, the potential arsenic and GAC that's pretty well known in the industry. More often than not, the GAC, both coal and coal-based and coconut, can have arsenic present. And then for ion exchange, nitrosamines are one of the big water quality concerns. So you're going to want to rinse to start off your media when you exchange or start up. You want to think about whether or not you want to get this media pre-rinsed or pre-washed. That can reduce the amount of washing you have to do on site, but it does come at a cost. So you need to balance the pros and cons there. Discharge flow rate versus storing this wash water really depends on where you're sending this backwash or rinse water. So you need to think through that. If it's going to a sewer, at what flow rate can you discharge? Do you need to store some of this rinse or wash water before, so you can get through, your change out, and then slowly, send it to the sewer if it's a restricted flow rate. Unchlorinated water is something that you want to use for ion exchange. The chlorine can release nitrosamines or degrade the performance of the media. Though some vendors will say a little bit's okay at startup, you really don't want to use chlorine in the water for ion exchange ultimately. And then lastly, automated versus manual operation. This is something that is important depending upon how frequently you're expecting to have to rinse, short-term downtimes or media exchanges, and then how large your facility is. So, how much operational burden is that going to be? Is it worth the extra cost to automate and put in actuators on your valves, that sort of thing? Something to consider. So some lessons learned from rinsing ion exchange in our Orange County sites that were mentioned earlier. So one, we were using well water to achieve that non-chlorinated source. And then the hydraulic condition was very different, whether we were discharging the rinse water to the atmosphere to waste, in this case going to the storm sewer, versus going into a 90 PSI distribution system. So those hydraulic conditions are very different, had to be accounted for. A VFD really helped in this case. Secondly, combining the discharge piping for a given set of vessels or a group of vessels is really helpful to then route it to a drain catchment with an air gap that's shown on the photo on the right, versus on the left, discharging it in the midst of the vessels is a little bit more crowded. You're probably going to get more splashing. So a lesson learned there that we encountered and implemented on future facilities. All right, hydraulics and piping. So the first thing to mention on this topic when it comes to putting in a PFAS treatment system on an existing water source is you're adding head loss. And so there's a hydraulic condition change that in order to keep the same production, you need to, overcome that with a booster pump or, upgrading, whatever upstream, pumping process is there for you. So that's one thing to consider, just how you do that and if you need to. The second thing, and maybe a little bit more nuanced and not as obvious, is thinking about startup. What do you need for startup? Where do you need to discharge, before or after treatment, things like that. And I'll go into that in a minute. So the first thing to mention as far as key questions on a groundwater system, whether you rehab the well pump or booster pump, the short answer that we've found is oftentimes if you have the space for a booster pump, it can be half the cost of rehabilitating the well pump, because that requires specialty equipment to pull the well and other things that increase your cost. And then as far as what flexibility you need during startup, you need to think about that ahead of time. And I'll talk a little bit about that as I wrap up some lessons learned on this. So again, the booster pump versus well pump, consider that booster on a groundwater source if you do have space. That's shown in the top right photo with a sound enclosure because we were in a residential area. Secondly, flexibility during startup. The photo on the bottom right shows two different discharges in one of our facilities where we planned for the flexibility to divert water both upstream and downstream of the treatment process. The reason that was helpful was to be able to divert some of the water upstream, allowed us to send a really low flow rate to the treatment vessels, because with ion exchange, you want to fill them very slowly. Again, because that media is very light, it can be moved around a lot if you're sending the water in too quickly. So having the flexibility to discharge both up and downstream of the process was really helpful. And then lastly, really thorough planning for pre-commissioning to get everything ready on your treatment system all your rotating equipment, all of that ahead of your disinfection and then your media fill. And the reason for that is once you get that media in there, it is much harder to disinfect again. You have to use a peroxide solution, for instance, and it becomes more complicated. So you want to be able to continuously operate after you get that media in. Less start and stop is better so that you avoid bacterial contamination. So that's just really a startup planning consideration that's important. Lastly, facility layout and integration. Facility layout integration, I should say. Couple things operationally. Think about the truck access to be able to exchange the media for a sorptive process. For membranes, you need to think about things like the space to be able to pull in and out those membranes and other things of that nature. But nevertheless, for this, you want to think about your truck access, and then also if you're in a residential or commercial area, which are typical of groundwater installations, you want to think about how your operational access needs may coincide or work together with the impacts on your layout to the neighboring entities, commercial entities, residential entities, and that sort of thing. So I'll talk through a couple of things on this topic. In this slide, you can see an aerial rendering on the left of a facility in Orange County, Orange County, California. This shows where we have a defined area within which we had some visual screening walls around the community neighbors, and then within that area we planned for enough access for staff and maybe a pickup truck, but then we allowed the media replacement truck to be able to come up to that area with an access road that was kind of a part of the park, but when it was not in use, it still allowed for that park space to be usable to the public. So that was one way that we accommodated sort of all of these different constraints for this facility. The second rendering on the right just shows that 3D renders can be really helpful in planning for visual screening, so that residential neighbors, for example, don't have to look at an industrial treatment site, out their back window. So to wrap up here, you want to know what the vendor truck sizes and hose lengths are to be able to plan for your access for when you need that media exchange. You want to have those trucks pull through continuously if you can, but they can back in and out of certain areas if needed. The rendering on the right shows a pretty constrained recreational park area that they would need to back into. They weren't able to pull through. And then you can also have some extra hose length provided by the vendors if needed. So you just want to know some of those things about the vendors while you're planning your site. And then lastly, just the 3D renders can be really helpful in community meetings and planning out your site with other city planners and departments, particularly for groundwater installations that are in the community. So to wrap up, pre-treatment and co-treatment should be carefully considered for the best long-term operable solution. Ancillary project components have and can have a significant impact on startup operations, performance and costs. So backwashing and rinsing, for example, and your piping for startup need to be thought through well in advance. And then lastly, the MCLs came out recently from EPA just this year, but a lot of states in certain parts of the country have had state regulations. There's a lot of implementation that's already been done and some lessons learned, examples of which I've shared in this presentation, but there's others out there, that we've been involved with as well. And so all these lessons learned are really valuable as more and more utilities are all thinking. You may be thinking about your treatment facility implementation. So keep that in mind, as well as the fact as that site-specific considerations are always going to be needed because every project's different. So with that, I will hand it over to Liz Garvey.
All right, great. Thanks very much, Tyler. So now we will talk about the management of PFAS residuals, including disposal options and optimization strategies. We'll also cover associated liabilities with these options, ways to protect your own utilities, as well as other important considerations. Next slide. So starting off, we're going to do an overview of CERCLA and RCRA. I know Nicolle earlier spoke a little bit about CERCLA and how it applies to PFAS residuals. We're going to dive in a bit more specifically here. But to start off, an overview of these two laws, they are very similar in terms of how the regulations are actually carried out, but there are some significant differences, key differences between these two laws. Starting off again, CERCLA is the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act. This addresses hazardous waste in the environment for unknown sources or sources from abandoned facilities. Under CERCLA, EPA can intervene in managing hazardous materials contamination released to the environment. It also helps EPA to find potentially responsible parties. This is often referred to as PRPs, and requires them to perform cleanup actions or pay for those cleanup actions. Congress created the Hazardous Waste Superfund for when no PRPs, potentially responsible parties, can be determined. You'll often hear CERCLA and Superfund being used synonymously, and that is where that Superfund word comes from. Then RCRA, on the other hand, RCRA stands for the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. This governs disposal of hazardous waste from operational facilities. So if you're a facility that creates these hazardous waste compounds, you have to actually register as a RCRA facility. So those owners are known. There's the key kind of distinction between the two. EPA under RCRA can control hazardous waste from cradle to grave, which essentially means from the generation of the hazardous waste to the transportation, treatment, storage, and eventual disposal. Under RCRA, EPA can set criteria for permitting, enforcement, continuous monitoring, as well as corrective actions or those requirements for cleanup. EPA does encourage close coordination between CERCLA and RCRA groups, and a key differentiator here really is that CERCLA looks sort of backwards in terms of the implications of hazardous waste on our environment, so what's already existing and where that came from, whereas RCRA looks more is forward thinking and more preventative. In terms of preventing additional hazardous waste getting into our environment. And the intersection between the two really lies at the producers, users, and receivers of this hazardous waste. Next slide. So starting with CERCLA and how it pertains to PFAS compounds. So in April of this year, again, as Nicolle mentioned, PFOA and PFOS were deemed hazardous compounds under CERCLA. This means that when 1 pound or more in a 24-hour period is released, that is a reportable incident. Important to note that, for most water treatment facilities, for example, this is not going to be an issue, but it is likely that this volume will decrease over time. So the likelihood of more facilities needing to report under CERCLA will increase as the years go on. The objective here of designating these compounds as hazardous is really to have polluters pay. So the actual creators of these hazardous compounds be responsible for the release into our environment. Some key features here include EPA's enforcement discretion policy, where they have said that they will not be going after farms with PFAS biosolids, municipal landfills and airports, community water systems and MS4s, as well as local fire departments. But the policy does not directly protect others from suing these groups. And this sort of rolls into the right of action for PRPs. So again, those potentially responsible parties. This right of action allows PRPs to sue other entities, such as water and wastewater municipalities, to sort of spread out that liability. Next slide, Tyler. So in terms of CERCLA, For the liability protections, or next steps for CERCLA, I should say, the liability protections that EPA has brought up in response to the concerns about these designations include the PRP settlement requirements. So EPA does plan to seek requirements that major PRPs waive the right to sue other parties, such as a water utility, under the discretion policy when these PRPs make settlements with EPA. Another way to address the concerns, there's a proposed act in place right now called the Water Systems PFAS Liability Act. What this act essentially would do is provide protections from financial liability under CERCLA for water and wastewater systems that comply with regulations for PFAS treatment and disposal. This is a bipartisan bill. It was brought to Senate in May of 2023 and to the House in April of this year. Again, it is just a proposed law at this point, but it is gaining a significant amount of traction with more House representatives and Senate co-sponsors. Another item to address the concerns with CERCLA include PRPs needing to implement controls. So EPA has stated that they may begin requiring actions from PRPs, such as in-kind services for institutional controls to address their hazardous waste output, as well as continued required monitoring. Next slide. Now for RCRA as it pertains to PFAS compounds. So recently, as of February 2024, proposed changes to RCRA were put in place for having 9 PFAS compounds be designated as hazardous constituents. Now, to be listed as a hazardous constituent under RCRA, a chemical must have toxic, carcinogenic, mutagenic, or teratogenic effects on humans or other life forms. And the EPA does have adequate data to prove, both from epidemiology studies and toxicology studies, that these 9 compounds do fulfill that requirement under RCRA. So essentially what this would do is expand the scope of constituents subject to RCRA corrective action processes, as well as the scope of facilities that EPA can apply these corrective actions to. So that includes RCRA treatment, storage, and disposal facilities. Listing these compounds as hazardous constituents is really a building block for improved handling and removal of PFAS in our environment. Next slide. So now we'll talk about the types of PFAS residuals from water treatment plants. So when you're treating for PFAS, you're really going to be seeing it in every process, every step of the way through your facility. Starting with pre-treatment residuals. So we're often seeing the residuals in the phases of flocculation and sedimentation basins. If you're using RO, so reverse osmosis, for PFAS removal in your water, you will almost definitively have a very high concentrated stream from your RO brine with PFAS concentration, as well as spent media. So that's from GAC, ion exchange, Fluorosorb, whatever adsorptive media you're using at your facility, if that's applicable for you. This is now going to be a PFAS-laden residual, as well as system commissioning and O&M. So this can be from backwash waste, depending on where you're sourcing your backwash from, sample and analyzer water, things like that. Next slide. Now we'll talk about a New England Public Water Systems survey. So this survey was conducted by the New England Waterworks Association's Residuals Committee, which I am a part of. The objective of this survey really was to identify PFAS residuals management methods and difficulties. We had about 73 water utilities respond to this survey, so pretty good turnout. An important note here, though, that the survey was actually conducted back in 2018, so the results are, of course, outdated. However, what this allows us to do is sort of provide a forecast of where the industry is going in terms of the options for feasible residuals management according to the laws and how the regulations are changing. Then on the next slide, we'll talk about the survey results. So we asked a plethora of questions, but one of the most relevant questions being, what are the methods of final water treatment plant residuals disposal? So we got a variety of answers here. And again, caveat to this, this was back in 2018, but many of the states in New England had PFAS regulations, both on the water treatment side as well as the waste handling, far before the EPA had these regulations in place. So these states have been needing to deal with it as far back as 2018. So these responses are still quite valid. So back then, sewer, we were looking at about 44% of utilities were sending their PFAS-laden waste to the sewer, 0 to incineration, about 7% land application. Landfills were just under 21%. Sending it to on-site basins, ponds, and lagoons was just under 18%, and then direct discharge to surface water accounted for about 8%. And then on the next slide, we'll talk about the forecasting of what we saw back in 2018 in comparison to what we're seeing now. So we're seeing a significant downtick in the use of sending residuals to the sewer. Again, with what we talked about previously with the potential liabilities associated with CERCLA and RCRA, we are seeing many of these wastewater utilities not wanting to take on the potential liability risk associated with accepting additional PFAS compounds. So significant downtick there. We are seeing an increase in incineration back in 2018, not as necessary of a process, at least as it was understood at the time. But now, with the understanding that incineration at high enough temperatures does actually do at least a partial breakdown of many of these PFAS compounds, we're seeing a significant increase there. Land application, as many of you probably know, has gone down. In the New England area, we were sending most of our residuals to Maine as well as Canada. Maine now has laws in place preventing, as of August of 2022, preventing folks from land applying at farms and things like that. Used to be looked at as beneficial reuse, but if you do have that PFAS-laden waste, it is no longer accepted. Canada has also placed temporary bans for all of the US and concentration limits for their land applied solids. We're also seeing a decrease in on-site basins, ponds, and lagoons, again, just with these facilities not wanting to have those PFAS residuals on their actual site and the potential liability associated. And then on the next slide, we'll talk about the sort of dual trend that we're seeing with landfills. So we're seeing a decrease in non-hazardous waste landfill application. Again, these facilities, similar to wastewater facilities, don't want to take on the potential liability of accepting these PFAS compounds. So we're seeing a decrease there, but an increase with hazardous waste landfill application. Again, as we talked about, these would be RCRA certified facilities, right? And so they are complying with the regulations under the EPA. It is significantly more expensive to send your waste to a hazardous waste landfill versus a non-hazardous waste landfill, but it is becoming a more feasible option for folks now. It's seeing a decrease in discharge to surface water as well, again with that potential liability association, and then an increase in destructive technologies. So back in 2018, we didn't even have destructive technologies as a option for one of the answers as to where you're sending your residuals, because there just wasn't understood that this was going to be a necessary means. But with some significant technology development and studies, we have seen an increase there. The Stantec Institute does a significant amount of studies and stays up to date on the specific technologies that are the most not only successful but feasible. And we try to keep everybody up to date with those feasible methods for use at your facilities or where to send your residuals for destruction. Then next slide, for looking at the hazardous waste landfill options throughout the U.S. So we spoke with Clean Harbors. Around the U.S., they have 5 hazardous waste closed loop landfills. These are facilities that are, and a key note here, accepting of PFAS-laden waste. You will sometimes find facilities that designate themselves as hazardous, but have not yet been agreeing to actually accepting PFAS compounds. So it's important to make sure of that before you partner with a facility. This closed loop item, that simply means that they manage their own leachate. So again, that helps with the liability association because they're not then putting it back into the environment. They are actually handling that leachate and that PFAS-laden leachate. Then on to the next slide, we'll look at the hazardous waste incinerators around the country and in Canada. So for this, again, we spoke with Clean Harbors as well as Veolia. The map here shows the different locations of these facilities. Again, all of these are facilities that are currently accepting of PFAS. Really important to make sure you're checking with these facilities before you decide to start working with them. These are all RCRA permitted facilities, at least those facilities that are in the US. Canada has its own designation for that. And then all of these facilities have a 99.9999% DRE, which is the destruction and removal efficiency. On the next slide, we'll look at landfills versus incineration and how to compare these two options. So for hazardous waste landfills, the acceptance may vary. Typically, we're seeing about concentrations of less than 1 parts per million in your residuals being accepted at hazardous waste landfills. The cost can significantly vary with concentration, but we are seeing about a 40% cost savings in comparison to sending waste to your hazardous waste incinerators. When you send your waste to a hazardous waste landfill, you do receive a certificate of disposal, but this is unfortunately still associated with a significant potential for liability risk. Hazardous waste incinerators, on the other hand, are accepting of all PFAS concentrations, and the costs can vary more, not so much with concentration, more so with the specific compounds that you are sending there. So for example, we've seen the costs increasing when you send AFFF, which as Joe mentioned earlier, is typically associated with firefighting foam. When you send your waste to a hazardous waste incinerator, you do receive a certificate of destruction, and that certificate of destruction is associated with a reduced liability for your facility. On the next slide, we'll talk about an option with GAC media. As Tyler went over, this is one of the most successful methods for removing PFAS in water. And the nice benefit of using GAC is that you can actually have a reactivation process. You're not needing to dump all of that media necessarily every time it gets spent. But we do often hear folks using regeneration and reactivation synonymously. And I do want to just clarify there, these two processes are different. So GAC regeneration is typically done at low temperatures or lower temperatures in comparison to reactivation. It removes some of the absorbed contaminants on the media. It can be performed in situ with hot gas, which is convenient, but the temperatures are typically too low to actually destroy most PFAS compounds. Reactivation, on the other hand, is typically done at much higher temperatures. It does remove and destroy adsorbed contaminants on the media. It's performed at specialized facilities in NSF 61 kilns, so compliant with drinking water. And it also has the benefit of returning carbon to a virgin-like state. And we have frequently been seeing about a 20 to 30% cost savings when you're reactivating your media versus replacing with fully virgin carbon. On the next slide, we'll look at some of the facilities throughout the U.S. after speaking with both Calgon and NORIT about their facilities that are performing this reactivation. So Calgon has facilities in Arizona, New York, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, and then NORIT does have that facility in Oklahoma. So next, looking at the destruction technologies. So these are a variety of technologies that the Stantec Institute has been studying and tracking and looking at the effectiveness and working with the different companies who are actually producing systems that can perform these destruction technologies. So here on the x-axis, this is essentially the technology readiness level, starting on the left with bench scale over to pilot scale, and then those technologies that are ready for full scale. The y-axis shows the PFAS destruction capability. So essentially the destruction effectiveness in terms of defluorination, so how much fluorine is actually coming off of the PFAS. Important to note, this chart just talks about the readiness and effectiveness. It is not consider feasibility, so you need to also be considering that in your decision making. If you decide, next slide, thank you, Tyler. If you decide to perform on-site destruction, many of the technologies I just talked to are occurring at specialized facilities, but we are seeing more and more options popping up for actual on-site destruction. So some important considerations here include mobilization fees and permitting. So many of these current destruction technologies on sites are just being piloted at the moment. They're either coming at very low cost to utilities or free, because it is a mutually beneficial relationship for these companies to be getting the data of the destruction efficiency, things like that, but making sure to advocate for yourself and understand what the mobilization fees are going to be, what the cost of treatment will be, permitting as well. And we've been working closely with some of these companies to make sure that we have a pretty solid grasp on that information to be able to best care for the water utility, and that it's not a major sticker value when we actually go to implement this at full scale. It's also important to consider the mass balance of these technologies. We've worked with some professors at the University of Massachusetts in the water department there who focus on the effectiveness of destruction technologies. And what they have discovered is that many technologies, as of right now, are missing about 20% fluorine when they do out their mass balance, which essentially means that that is a lack of actual destruction. And so we've also been talking with our local permitting agencies about what that means, what true goals are. That will most likely vary from state to state. So again, keeping close contact with your local regulators is important. Next slide, Tyler. So now for liquid stream destruction, this depends on the actual concentration of PFAS. So if you choose to do liquid stream destruction at your facility, it is very beneficial to do some form of pre-concentration before you actually conduct your destruction. So this can be done through liquid solid separators, foam fractionation, which is gaining more traction, as well as membrane pre-concentration, which typically is in the form of either NF or mostly RO membranes, and you will ultimately see improved degradation there. Important note as well, the water matrix constituents, the background organics will compete with PFAS and use up oxidants, so removing those preemptively is important as well. And then sort of to summarize, increasing cost considerations when we're looking at life cycle costs and analysis of our PFAS treatment, you do want to make sure that you're not skipping over or not underestimating the feasible destruction or disposal options that you need to conduct for your facility, because this is anticipated to have significant cost implications for water utilities. But to sort of help with that, we're encouraging folks to get in line for funding. So that's SRF funding, state revolving funding, as well as grant funding. I know that Stantec does have our funding services group available, who we frequently use a lot more than we used to for getting our clients in line with this funding. As well as the benefits for concentrating and reducing your overall waste. When you can concentrate, whether you're destructing on site or sending to a waste facility, that lower volume or just faster kinetics of your destruction will help to ultimately reduce cost. And then again, future destruction, keeping an eye out for those destruction technologies and development there, as well as efficiencies that will be helpful to you. And that is all that I have today. I will pass it back over to Tony to host the question session.
All right, well, thanks, team. Lots of great information. We have a number of good questions here already, and I encourage our listeners to keep them coming by typing them into the Q&A drop-down panel that is at the top of your screen. All right, so let's start with Joe. As you're conducting source water assessment for PFAS, what do you recommend that utilities do when they identify a potential source?
The first is a kind of a prelude, is to understand that we follow the multiple barrier approach in water treatment. I think we all agree with that, and that's been around for more than 100 years. So that involves, let's go to the source and look at source protection. So one way to address this is to initially work with if you identify a source, with the polluter of the PFAS, to see how you can best address it on their end to be able to reduce concentrations or totally eliminate that source of PFAS from the source water. So that would be the first thing. The second aspect, which is not the preferred aspect, but actually has happened many, many times in the U.S., is litigation. And litigation, of course, takes a long time over a longer period. So if it certainly doesn't work, then we need to look at mitigative measures that might occur. And so that could involve looking at things like blending, if you have a ground or of treatment technologies.
All right, now, Nicolle, I think this next one could be for you. When do I need to have treatment in place to comply with the MCL?
So I think you need to have treatment in place by 5 years from the date of promulgation, which is in April of 2029. However, I mentioned briefly that the compliance is calculated with a running annual average. So really looking at it, you probably need to have treatment in place and running at least 3 quarters before the compliance date, so that the running annual average will meet the requirements of the MCL. And so, yeah, so that could be potentially 4 years from the promulgation date. So obviously that's pretty quick. I think that if utilities are showing progress in that direction, there's probably conversations that can be had with the health departments to talk about the progress that's being made. I personally understand how long these projects can take, depending on the size. But based on the rule, I think that's what we're seeing.
All right, thanks. Tyler, I think this next one is for you. When implementing treatment systems, can you provide additional considerations for conveying and handling the volume of water needed for the media placement? Maybe what are some key differences in conveying and handling the GAC versus the ion exchange? And lastly, what kind of volume of waste can a utility expect?
Sure. Yeah. Good question. Good 3 questions in one. So I'll start with, I guess, the differences between GAC and IX as far as some of that rinse and waste water that would be generated. So mentioned before the ion exchange, most of the resin out there, although some do say that they have chlorine resistance, most of the resin is susceptible to degradation by chlorine. So you need to use unchlorinated water for IX only. That doesn't necessarily apply to GAC. So that's one thing. When you're handling GAC, during the initial change out of that media and then rinsing it, you're going to get a lot of fines. So anyone who's started up a GAC, the water can look even black for a little bit because you're rinsing out some fines. That's something that you're going to get that's a little bit different than ion exchange. As far as volumes you can expect, this will depend on whether or not you get it pre-rinsed or washed. You can get an acid wash on GAC or a pre-rinse on IX. In the case of IX, if you get it pre-rinsed, for example, some of the installations in Orange County that we did, we only rinsed for about a couple of bed volumes, or maybe 10 or 20,000 gallons. We were able to send that directly to the storm sewer. So that's one example of pre-rinsed IX as far as waste volumes. For GAC, recommendation is generally a good rule of thumb to start with is 10 bed volumes. So for a 12-foot diameter, 20,000 pound GAC vessel, that's 100,000 gallons of water as far as a waste volume. So as an example of that, in one of our installations, we ended up with a little over 200,000 gallon waste holding tank to be able to do at least 2 backwashes or 2 change outs of GAC media, and then be able to store that in that waste volume, 200,000 gallons, and then send it to sewer slowly. The discharge rate we were limited to was about 200 GPM, so we had to send it to a waste tank first before going to sewer. So hopefully that helps answer that question.
Yeah, and you know what? Well, I've got you. Can you answer this one for us? Why do you have to use non-chlorinated water for backwashing GAC?
Sure. Yeah. So actually, that was something that might have been mistaken. So non-chlorinated water is needed for ion exchange. It's not necessarily needed for GAC. So if you have chlorine in the water, when it goes through your GAC is going to quench the chlorine. You're not going to end up with it going out. But in this case, for PFAS treatment systems, it's not a concern necessarily for using that chlorinated water for GAC.
All right, thanks. Liz, I got a couple here for you. Do you expect carbon reactivation costs to increase significantly as demand increases?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And we have kind of been pushing some of the carbon manufacturers to answer some of those questions. What we have seen is some of the facilities that we work with, the utilities that we work with, they typically will have a contract with these carbon suppliers, 5 years, 3 years. Some of those contract lengths are decreasing. And what we have seen as of late is a significant increase in price associated with both the virgin sourcing of the virgin media as well as the reactivation process. But even through those upward trends, we are still seeing a significant savings if you do go about the process of reactivating your GAC versus always just using solely virgin material. And what I didn't mention in my presentation, and I do want to mention here, is when you are doing a reactivation process, it's important that you consider having a swing load. So say, for example, you have 2 GAC vessels, your lead and lag typical, right? If you're going to send one of your vessels has spent media, so you are seeing breakthrough in the lead vessel for that media, you're sending that away to a facility for reactivation. Now that can take sometimes probably the fastest is a month, but it can take up to 6 months, again, depending on timing and the state of the industry at the time and how much demand there is. So what we do recommend is having a third virgin set of media for that lead vessel while your other media is being reactivated. These reactivation facilities will hold, at least from what we've been seeing, they will hold your set of media for the time being until another set has seen breakthrough, and you need to continue that cycle. And what this helps facilities do is prevent the delay of operations of their facility, or reduces the lack of redundancy that you would have to go through if you didn't have a swing load.
All right, thanks. Joe, how common is PFAS fingerprinting being used to help identify the source, the type of the original PFAS?
Yeah, it's being used more and more, but I would not say that is widespread as of this time. But as we realize, and surface waters become, particularly in surface waters, where the implications are for larger utilities, that will become more and more a response to increasing PFAS concentrations. The challenge is, of course, is that in many instances, despite even if you fingerprint and you do the other water quality analyses associated with trying to identify a source, regardless, the PFAS concentrations are often diffuse and widespread. So it's very often very difficult to actually pinpoint one source, even if you're doing an extensive fingerprinting exercise. So when it's a point source, fingerprinting obviously becomes much, much easier. But if we have sources that are really nondescript or may come from various different parts of the catchment area, it may be more difficult to do. But I think we're going to see that become more and more prevalent as time goes on.
All right, thanks. I'm going to add Ryan into the group now. Ryan, can you talk to us about the availability of either the IX and the GAC systems, any supply chain concerns in getting treatment systems, and maybe what is the typical delivery from an approved order?
Sure. Yeah. Good question. I guess what I would say to that is it does depend. We're seeing the large suppliers ramp up their capabilities for producing both GAC and ion exchange resins. And at the same time, there are more suppliers vying to get into the market. So you might also, another question to this might be, what level of acceptance does your particular state have for these different types of sorbents that are entering the market? As the MDA or the departments of health start to add approved suppliers to the list, that will help the supply and demand chain. However, I think as it stands, most states have relatively few approved suppliers. Another note would be sometimes at certain periods of the year, there are some competing industries that work that demand GAC or IX. We've ran into this in some of our installations where the beverage industry has maybe taken the place or had greater demand for the material than what the utility could generate. And so preference was given to the beverage industry. So planning ahead is something you definitely want to do. To the question about how far in advance, we are seeing it again, it varies. So you may need to be looking at several months of time before you can get your order. So I would say you need to be monitoring the breakthrough of your PFAS through the vessels. So your lead lag, be watching the effluent from that lead vessel if you're in a lead lag configuration, so that you can get several months of time to get the order in place. And then be ready with some alternative suppliers if needed. I've been mostly talking about GAC. When it comes to ion exchange resin, There are a number of different suppliers coming into market, and you have to be thinking about what type of resin. Tyler mentioned gel resins. There are also macroporous resins. So work with your associated departments of health or regulation agencies to make sure that you can get your hands on an approved type of resin.
All right, thanks. I'm going to put out one last call here for questions. Otherwise, we're going to wrap it up today. I would like to say thank you to all of our presenters and thank you for everyone's participation in the audience. If you have any other questions for Nicolle, Joe, Liz, or Tyler, their contact information is located in the chat. You could also find Ryan Capel on our stantec.com, as I did not drop in a link for that one. You will receive an email next week with your participation certificate and a link to this presentation on stantec.com if you'd like to listen again or share with a colleague. We've also dropped a link into the chat window and we'll include in that email a link to our first PFAS webinar. Our next presentation will be on Wednesday, November 20th, where our panel will be talking about machine learning and AI applications and their value in the water industry. We hope you can join us again soon. Thanks, everyone.